Okay, so thank you for kind of going through my background. So me, sort of in a nutshell, professionally, where just so you know where I've learned what we're going to talk about today, I was I led technical communications at a small company called NVIDIA, then moved to Ping Identity, then went on to Amazon and ran global content teams for Amazon Seller Support and AWS. Then I moved over to Zoomin, moved to the vendor side, and did VP of Customer Experience at Zoomin. And just recently, I think this is week 3, I have moved over to Senior Director of, as she said, self-helping content strategy at Reltio, which has been super fun. It's great to get back on the content side. The vendor side was fun too, don't get me wrong, but it's really nice to get back on the content strategy side. So those are the things that sort of make me who I am today in terms of a professional. But the one thing that I've really learned is that being human does not make me an expert on humans. So we're going to talk today about how tech docs are consumed across countries, industries, some of the trends, but keep in mind that you guys have perspectives that perhaps I haven't had. And so I want to hear from you as well as we're going through this. So please stick stuff in the chat. I'll try and keep an eye on it. Amanda or Dominique, if something interesting comes into the chat, feel free to cut me off and we'll have a little chit chat about whatever's going on there too. So, all right. So in order to really talk about the trends of how content is being consumed, we need to understand the factors, what really factors into the consumption of content. Now, I've come up with 4 factors, and I'll be the first to say this is not a comprehensive list. There are many that I know of that I left off, and probably many that I haven't even imagined that I left off. But I just sort of took the big sort of chunks. So the first factor of how tech content is consumed is really technology. And I find this to be kind of the foundational factor, right? Because it kind of has fingers in all of the other factors. So when you think about technology changes from the late 1900s to the early 2000s and even to today, you can really see a difference in how content plays a role in our world. I would suggest that technological changes didn't necessarily impact consumption as much as it impacted creation and management, until we got to that point of having a PDF. And as soon as we got the PDF, all of a sudden, we sort of opened up to digital delivery. And from that point on, how we consume content has really changed drastically. Obviously, HTML also played a role in that. But really from tech content standpoint, I think PDF was sort of that start, and then we moved into HTML. Now, when I started as a technical writer way back in the day, the internet wasn't really used that much at all. So, I mean, that tells you how old I am, right? So we really weren't using the internet for everyday news and all the stuff we use it for today. And we certainly weren't using it for technical documentation. So we didn't really think about content strategy at the time. We sort of knew that we had to build these books, and it was really more of a book strategy that we had. When the 1990s hit, we saw the sort of paper to digital revolution, thanks to the advent of PDF. And of course, we all know that PDFs changed our world back then. However, people tended to move their sort of large documents from Word files or FrameMaker files into PDF, but they still looked like books, and we still use them like books. And so there wasn't that big of a change in terms of how we consume them, but the big change there was we were able to take them on the go much more easily. We were able to share them much more easily. Cost came down, right? So all of these things helped us change how we consumed it a little bit. Now, PDFs were all the rage for way longer than they probably should have been. We all know how difficult it is to sort of create and manage PDFs today versus doing some sort of dynamic delivery. But PDFs were really something people stuck to. And I think it's because we were so used to book format and people wanted the index and they wanted the table of contents and they wanted all that good stuff that came out of book delivery. I would say in the past, probably, honestly, COVID really made a big shift here, but maybe the past 5 years, we've kind of gotten away from relying on PDFs, and some of the other factors that we're going to talk about coming up are what I would say are the cause of that. So with HTML delivery, we have a much different way that we can actually deliver content. So now we're doing HTML doc portals. If you think about doc portals back in 2010 versus how they look today, they look very different. And there's a reason for that. We have other technology and other changes going on in our worlds that change our expectations. And so we have to keep our doc portals sort of up with the times. And so, for example, back in 2010, we didn't really use filters and facets that much. I mean, certainly some folks did, but they didn't really become mainstream until everybody was on Amazon all the time. And all of a sudden, oh, we have to have filters and facets, right? Because they're really popularized by Amazon. So that's an example of where technology really bled into what we do today. And now you can't really imagine technical content without having some sort of filters and facets. So now it's sort of table stakes. So when we think about where we are today and looking to the future from a technology standpoint, we need to think about how people are using content in general. So think about some of the consumer apps that you use. And this is a question that I actually have for you guys, and I'd love to see your answers in the chat. And that is, what consumer applications, whether it's an actual app on your phone or a website, what are those consumer apps that sort of inspire you and make you think about technical communication differently? So if you have any, go ahead and throw them in the chat. I'm going to tell you about my favorite one. And if you've ever heard me speak in the last 2 years, you've heard about this. So apologies for boring you again with it. But if you look up Brooks Shoe Finder is the most amazing app I've ever seen. And I swear I need to buy stock in Brooks because I talk about this all the time. So Brooks Shoe Finder, if you think about how shoes fit, it's kind of boring, right? Like, who really wants to think about how their shoes fit, right? That just seems kind of silly. However, the Brooks Shoe Finder app steps you through in a way that makes it not only understandable, but actually really enjoyable to figure out how and why your shoes fit the way they do. So give it a try. You'll see it'll come in. The first question it says is, where are you going to run? And your only choice is outside or inside, basically. Or I think it's like flat surfaces or trail, something like that. It gives you really, really easy questions. And then if you want to know why that matters, you can click about the science and it'll tell you the science behind why that matters and how that makes a different shoe. But it tells you in a way that's so simple to understand. Even my 9-year-old understands it. So the technology of that app and the thinking of that app is really driving my expectations for the content that I get, even in a B2B scenario. And so because of that, we need to think about those consumer apps and how they're impacting our B2B apps as well. So I don't see any great examples coming in on the chat, but do some thinking and keep putting them in, and we'll come back to that. So technology is the first factor that we really need to think about. Now, the second factor in that impacts content consumption is industry. So if you think about what industry folks are in, that will impact how they use your content. Now, how do I know this? Well, when I was at Zoomin, we did a study with Frost and Sullivan, and we looked at doc portal users specifically. So these are people that are predisposed to using doc portals. They're very good at using doc portals. And we asked them, basically, where do you first seek technical information? And naturally, because they're doc portal users, they said, well, doc portals, 53% of the time, right? So a lot of the time they use doc portals. almost twice as much as they use a search engine, which was kind of surprising. And then they had communities and forums were like 6%, ask a colleague was 6%, and contact support was 3%. What's interesting about that is we divided the difference between those that were working in the tech industry versus those that were working in another industry, say medical, pharmaceuticals, I don't know, finance, whatever. So technical versus non-technical. And the technical folks, the people, not technical people, but people working in the technical industry were far more likely to go to the doc portal than the people not working in the tech industry, which was interesting in itself. The other thing that's really, really interesting about the studies that we did was that the vast majority, I mean, we're talking like 93%, I think, would rather self-serve, meaning go to the doc portal, use a search engine, or go to a community forum versus asking another human being. And that included both asking a support agent as well as asking a colleague. So that was really interesting. So, and that didn't really change across tech versus other, except that the self-serve, the way they wanted to self-serve changed slightly. So if they were in the tech world, then they were more likely to use a doc portal, less likely to use a search engine. And then if they were not in the tech world, it was pretty even between doc portal and search engine. So that was the big change there. So that was interesting stuff. So we have, for the factors so far, we have technology and industry. Now, the third one I want to talk about is geography. And within geography, I'm putting a lot of other sort of micro factors. So let's talk about those. So we know that where you live or where you access information will change how you use it. Now, there's huge factors like socioeconomics in the form of either education or ability to buy technology. We know that these are really, really big factors in how people consume information. There's also the idea of localization and translation, which to most of you is very, very important, right? That's probably a primary reason why you're here. So localization and translation is sort of based on geography, but it's not always based on geography, right? Localization certainly gives an idea of, well, you need to be appropriate to the specific geography you're in, but there's so many more factors that go in there. And so we as content creators need to understand, not only do we need to translate for certain languages, do we need to localize for certain locales, but also within those locales, are there like cultural norms that will change the answer? And so I'm going to give you an example of this. When I was at Amazon Seller Support, we did a massive study and we brought a bunch of sellers in so that we could actually talk to them in person. And part of the study and part of the talking to customers made me realize something huge about our translation. We had made the goal of, if somebody speaks another language, we will deliver in their language. And it was a blanket statement, and it added a ton of cost and a ton of complexity, and it made our processes longer. But we thought, well, this is worth it because all people will trust content more. This was our hypothesis. All people will trust content more if it's in their own language. What we found was that there were certain places, Poland is one that I remember, where the Polish people were saying, you know what? We speak English really well. We actually trust your content more in English than we do if you translate it to Polish. And that was a huge learning for me, because then we could look at it and say, oh, do we need to be translating to Polish? Maybe, maybe not. Now, this happened to be Amazon sellers. It may be a different story in a different industry. You have to do the research, but understanding how people are consuming your information, what language they choose, no matter what language they speak, is a really, really important thing for us to think about. So geography incorporated with localization is another big factor. And then the last factor that I want to talk about, I'm kind of putting, again, two sort of big factors together, age/generation. Now, we know that age and generation are different things because people who are baby boomers were once 20 and now they're 80. And people who are millennials were once, in high school and now they're working, right? They're out there in the working age. So we know that these things are different, but they are somewhat related. And so just to give you an example, I once asked my kiddos, who are all between the ages now of 9 and 14. At this time, I don't know, they would have been like probably 8 to 13, let's say. So I asked one of my kids, I think I was on the phone or I was doing something through a window, and I made this sign, like, I need to make a call. Like I was trying to tell them I'm making a phone call, right? So I did this sign, which any of us who were born in the 1900s, we know, like, okay, this obviously means phone. So my kid, I thought he got the message and I thought he was going to go out and make the call or do whatever I wanted him to do. And he didn't do it. And then later I said, well, but why did you nod when I went like this? He's like, well, I don't know what that meant. He said, you want me to put a banana to my ear? Like that, it made no sense to me. And I thought about, I'm like, who doesn't know that this means call me, right? Like, who doesn't know that? And then I recognized that he's never seen the phone that looks like this, right? He's only seen a handheld device that you put to your ear. So I asked him, if you wanted to sign to somebody, you want them to call you, what would you do? And he went, I'd go like this. And it was such an eye opener to think, oh my gosh, wow. Okay, so I was giving a sign and he was consuming it in a totally different, unexpected way because of his age and his generation and his experiences. So that was a real eye opener. So when we think about age really relates to lifestyle, the knowledge, the experiences, and most importantly, I think, the learned biases. So everybody sort of learns biases throughout their life. If they've been once bitten, twice shy with self-service, they might be less likely to engage in self-service again. If they have learned that technical content is not easy to follow, they may be less likely to engage with it. So kind of the older you get, the more likely you are to have learned some of these sort of biases that might impact how you consume content. And so generation is somewhat different. So generation really relates to this willingness to adopt technology, the values, the generational trends that change how people interact with content. And these things change because of the life experiences that they had when they were young, predominantly, right? This is why PDF stayed as long as they did, right? The baby boomers who finally realized that PDF was the coolest thing since sliced bread, they didn't want to let go of PDFs. And so forever and ever and ever, if you tried to say, I want to do a doc portal, it's going to be dynamic delivery HTML. The baby boomers that you were spouting that to were like, la, 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 la. I don't know what any of that means. Just give me a PDF, right? And so I think this is why we consume PDF as long as we did. It wasn't because it was a better technology. So anyway, so anyone that is sort of younger than me, so let's say millennials all the way through this new COVID generation, I think they're calling it Generation A. I'm going to call it the COVID generation because it really is. I think they all put their trust in self-service very easily, and they are much less likely to contact a person, to ask a colleague or contact support. Whereas someone my age, I'm probably more likely most often to sort of pick up the phone and contact someone. I'd say I'm, 50-50. So age and generation plays a big, big factor. Generation also bleeds into technology when it comes to things like TikTok and YouTube. When we think about how kids are consuming information, if you have kids today that have smartphones, you'll see they're on their phones watching YouTube videos almost 100% of the time, unless you take the phone away, which, we have to do a lot. So that is just how they interact with the world today. And because of that, video is going to become more and more and more and more important. So we're going to have to be able to create video more scalably in the future, because that's going to be the only way that some of these now kids, when they become adults, that they know how to learn. So these are all factors in how we consume content. So I'm going to pause there for a minute. I want to go to the chat because it looks like some good stuff. Dominique, did you notice anything you want to bring up?
Megan, yes, I think there's been a few people who have answered about what's the B2C apps that you like in terms of
nice.
So Dominique said augmented reality.
Yes.
And Don Bridges I think he found your website. It's called brooksrunning.com.
Yes.
Is that it?
Okay. There's an app on the phone. Like you can either do it on your phone or you can do it on the website. Either way. Okay. But yes, that's it. So definitely try that. Google Assistant, I see.
Yeah. Shane.
Doctor, I don't know this one. Looking for doctors and specialists.
Yeah, this is a purely French. That's a French website. Yes, where you book your appointment with the doctor without even calling his secretary. So
very nice. Oh, I need that. That sounds good. And Kit's got a whole lot here. My kids don't remember phones for talking, not text. That's so true. If I need to get my kids to talk to somebody, they're like, no, I'll just text them. Oh, okay. All right. Very good. Frida's saying there's still a lot of people stuck on PDF. Yes, that's true. And you know what I'm curious about? I'm curious about whether there are certain locales where that's more true. So I know in the US, we're sort of moving beyond. There are people that are stuck in PDF. There's definitely still a need for PDF when it comes to people can't be online. They need to download something. So there's still a need for it, but I think in terms of sort of dynamic delivery of PDF instead of managing PDFs. But I'd be curious to know if anyone out there, I think this is a global audience. So if anyone's in a location that has a specific reason for sticking with PDF, definitely stick that in there because I'd love to know. All right, so let me move on. So why do we care about these factors? Why do these factors really make a difference in how we consume content? So again, there's probably a whole long laundry list of why, but I'm going to give you a few. So the first is accessibility. So accessibility is huge. And I mean, both in terms of when we think about accessible content based on ability, but also accessibility based on Wi-Fi service and accessibility based on ability to buy certain tech products. And, any kind of accessibility based on ability to read the language, right? So all of these things play into whether or not people can access the information that you're providing. The second big impact, and this is one that is sort of my passion project, is all about trust. So all of these things, if we're sending stuff out with the right technology and, in the right locations to the right people, we can build trust. And one thing that we need to understand is that trust is multifaceted. And so I actually did a study at Amazon Seller Support that was fascinating. We did this. It became sort of a thing that stuck with us. We did what we called the Customer Trust Index. And it really was, it was almost scientific research because we were at Amazon, so we could get all kinds of data, right? So we sent out to, say, 20,000 sellers and asked them to rate their trust of Amazon Seller Support based on a number of factors. And those factors really revolved around content. So the factors were accuracy, helpfulness, consistency, and engagement. We asked a number of questions for each. We asked a different question every single week. It wasn't the same people every time. We were we had a big polling mechanism where you could only poll a certain number of people on a certain question at a certain time frame. But every single week we got between 3,000 and 5,000 responses. And what we found was the biggest trust buster, hands down, was consistency. Inconsistent information was the biggest trust buster at seller support. And because of that, we were able to dive in and figure out where the inconsistency was. It happened to be between help content and the content that was sent out by agents. So we were able to dive in and fix that. But this is something to really think about, especially as we're looking at these factors. So when you think about age or generation, how do we build trust with millennials versus how we would build trust with baby boomers? Very different, right? They're going to consume different content, first of all, and they're going to trust and become loyal to a very different set of content. And so it's really important to think about trust as we consider these factors. And then the last one I want to talk about is enjoyment. And this seems like kind of a funny thing to have boiled down to one of my top three, but I'll tell you why I did. I read a study I actually was doing a lot of research on self-service technology, which included, chatbots and the self-service technology you have at the grocery store when you go there. So everything in between, right? This one study that I found was really about the self-service technology at the grocery stores. And they in essence said, okay, well, they stood outside the grocery store, and as people came out, they said to them, did you go through self-service or did you go through a lane? And they then started asking questions based on what made them choose self-service over a human lane, or what made them choose a human lane over self-service. They had all kinds of things, but what they came down to, they used all of these different factors to decide what made them most likely to perceive their experience as high quality. And what they found was that enjoyment was the big winner. Out of all the various, convenience and all the other factors that they looked at, enjoyment most led to a perception of quality. And I thought that was super interesting, because we don't really think in that way around tech content. We don't think, oh, is someone going to enjoy this, right? We think, well, is it accurate? Are they going to be able to do what they want to do? But the biggest perception of quality might be around, do they even know they're using tech content? So that made me create a tenet for my new role, which is really about amazing technical content shouldn't feel like technical content. It should be something somewhat enjoyable, akin to and inspired by that brick shoe finder. So I thought that was really interesting. So I'm going to stop there, pause there for a minute. Any other impacts that you guys can think of? No? Okay. Very good. Okay, so we're going to move into trends. So we have a couple big trends I want to talk about today that really impact how we consume content as well as when we consume content. So Saas, software as a service, has created this experience economy. I think you all have heard this before, but I'll spell it out just in case. So with software as a service, we now have subscriptions. We don't have necessarily on-premise single license. It's a subscription, which means that your customers can leave anytime that subscription comes up for renewal, right? And that means that the experience they have during their customer journey is in essence dictating whether or not they renew, right? So that has created this experience economy that is so vital to organizations today. Now, when I think about tech content, 25 years ago, maybe even 15 years ago, we really thought about tech content starting at purchase. Basically, once a customer became a customer, then technical content became a factor. totally different today. Today, technical content is looked at during the awareness stage, during the consideration, at acquisition, during service, and even in building customer loyalty. So no longer can we say we start our job at the purchase. Now we have to say, yes, we have some stuff that starts at purchase and goes forward, but how can we also use that to continually drive revenue throughout the organization? And what of that is being used in the sales cycle? So that's one of the big trends today. And part of that, the research that we did back at Zoomin, we found that 86% of executives recognize that people use doc portals for research before a purchase. That's huge, right? So people are using doc portals for research before a purchase. And most importantly, your CS and CX execs understand this. They know this, right? So that's huge. The second trend that I'm seeing is a trend away from just technical content and KB articles and training to this idea, this overarching idea of digital self-service. So I believe that everything will be considered under an umbrella of digital self-service, sitting under a chief customer officer or other sort of customer-oriented leader. So when we think about this, we used to write these big books, right? Back in, I don't know, the 1990s and 2000s. They were these massive books that we'd print and we'd send them out to people. And then they'd probably sit on a shelf. And we always joked like, well, no one's ever going to read them, right? They're just going to sit there, but we have to have them perfect. So now we have this ability to self-serve, and it has become a basic expectation. In fact, the Zoomin survey that we did came back and said 91% of these people, now keep in mind, these are people who are predisposed to using doc portals. 91% of people prefer to self-serve over asking another human. That's a huge number, right? So once you get people engaged in a doc portal, you get them engaged in self-service, they are much, 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 much more likely to self-serve than try and ask a human. So I have a couple questions actually for the audience, but I want to see if there's any questions coming up on the chat in the meantime.
We've had more comments actually than questions. Frida says that her generation gap story was the day her son visited the office and saw her IBM Selectric typewriter. And he said, it's a funny keyboard with a built-in printer.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Yeah.
That reminds me of the people that don't know how to use those old dial phones. You know, you hand a young kid now a dial phone and they're like, I have no idea. How do you do a number here? That's interesting. Exactly. Okay. Dominique says old engineers still print PDFs. Yes, that's true.
Yes. Yes. And somebody said about Japan that they still use PDFs. Yeah. Rafaela says that the Salesforce release notes 600 pages in PDF are still being printed in Japan.
Do we know why, Rafaela? Do you have any hypotheses as to why that would be?
So I was chatting with the marketing team in Japan, and it's just a question of taking notes, having a book, essentially. And also another thing that they want is, we still provide, HTML, of course, and then PDF for each document we have, mainly for Japan, because they like paper, they like to print, they like to have the book.
Interesting. Very interesting.
Right?
Yeah. And I wonder, like, it just brings all kinds of questions to mind. Like, do they like the book because it's their culture to be able to write it down? And if so, would having some sort of a notebook where they could actually write on their tablet, would that suffice? Or is it more that the language is somehow more difficult to consume on screen and write on screen? So I don't know, it brings all kinds of questions to mind, but it's super interesting. Very nice. Thanks for sharing, Rafaela.
Thank you.
And Kevin asked, how do people feel about the flip books? Yes, we had some responses that we prefer the good old PDF to flip books, which are very difficult to use.
So on the flip books, are we talking about the thing where like you scroll up and it kind of flips up like this instead of
flips left to right? It's a
like in the readers. Like an ebook. Got it. Yeah.
They're pretty horrible to use.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Very good stuff.
Kit says COVID is going to accelerate the digital transformation. I think the stress around the pandemic has permanently changed consumer behavior in some areas.
Absolutely.
And a few people have responded to the question you asked a couple of minutes ago. Dominique replied, gamification in learning, and Kit, virtual reality.
Yeah, very nice. Okay.
And cool. Jay Miles asks you, do you have any real great examples of self-service documentation portals?
Yes. So ServiceNow has a really nice documentation portal. Imperva has really nice. I'm not entirely sure if these are open to everyone, so I'm sorry if I'm giving you one that's locked down. NetApp actually does a fabulous job with documentation. Those are three to sort of start with. Salesforce, of course. Salesforce is sort of the obvious. Their whole Trailblazer combination of training and tech docs and everything. So they've got some really cool stuff going on there too. Those are just a few. I'm sure there's more. Good question.
Ronnie asks, do you find that people distinguish between different kinds of information? For example, education, documentation, tutorials, etc.
That's a really good question. So one of my, I don't know if I'll call it a pet peeve, but one of my big things that I'm constantly fighting for is when you think about I call it the dreaded landing page. So when you go in to get help, and you end up on this landing page that says, do you want technical support? Do you want documentation? Do you want training? Or do you want knowledge? That, I think, is one of the worst experiences in the history of bad experiences, because to Ronnie's point, people don't know if they want documentation or knowledge. They don't know whether we have an answer in documentation or if we don't, and they actually should be talking to a person. So having a landing page where you make them choose, do you want a tutorial? Do you want education? Do you want documentation? Don't do that. In my opinion, do not do that, because they don't know. Give them a search bar. As they're typing, you can bring up the list and say, okay, here's what we have in education. Here's what we have in tutorials. Here's what we have in documentation. That's fine. But that landing page where you make them decide how they want help before they even know the scope of what's within it, that's one of my big pushes. So hopefully that answers your question, Ronnie.
Frida adds to the PDF discussion that in regulated industries, you need to submit a PDF and get it approved.
Yes.
And you can't update or change without another approval cycle.
Yeah. There's always those times. Absolutely. Now, the question is, do you have to have a PDF? Like often if it's regulated, you have to have a PDF that doesn't change, but you still could have dynamic HTML that dynamically creates a PDF, and you just mark it. We printed it at this date, and then you don't have to manage PDFs. But yes, that's true. That's a good point.
We have a comment from Matthias. Most doc portals I have seen and used in the recent past are more technical than general consumer. The main advantage of those is not really the different way of consuming information, but more their feature and ability to integrate them with your Git repositories, your code, your change requests, your pipelines, and generate content, images, etc.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And actually, this came up just this past week. We had somebody who was trying to help us update our documentation. It was a consultant that was brought in before I started, and a really good consultant. but this consultant is really focused on UX. And so they dove in to try and get some quick wins. And the first thing they went to were the API docs. Now, they didn't recognize that the API docs had actually been moved from the doc portal to a new dev portal in Swagger, because customers were demanding that they be able to go in and test and execute the code directly from Swagger, right? So they did this whole rebuild of API documentation. And when they sent it out, I looked at it and I went, no, guys, this isn't going to work. Like, yeah, it's prettier, but it's not going to work. And developers need function over form. They don't really care about the form as much as they care about the function. So yeah, I think that's a really, really good point, and something we think about more obviously in B2B, especially when we have very technical, very complex products, and when APIs are involved. It's kind of a whole other story.